Marcus learned to leave 10 minutes early for everywhere he went, not because of traffic, but because of the inevitable police stops that had become part of his daily routine. Fighting it only made things worse.
Don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and a comment before we start to learn more about what happened.
The alarm on Marcus Williams' phone buzzed at 6:45 a.m., just like every weekday morning. But instead of hitting snooze like most 17-year-olds would, Marcus immediately sat up and reached for the clothes he had laid out the night before: dark jeans, a plain navy hoodie, and his cleanest pair of sneakers. Nothing flashy, nothing that could be misinterpreted, nothing that would draw attention. He had learned these lessons the hard way. Marcus lived in Riverside Heights, a middle-class neighborhood where tree-lined streets wound between modest two-story homes with well-maintained lawns. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names and kids rode bikes until streetlights came on. For most residents, it felt safe and peaceful. For Marcus, it had become a maze of potential encounters he had to navigate carefully every single day. His mother, Sandra, was already in the kitchen making coffee when he came downstairs. She looked up as he entered, automatically scanning his appearance with the practiced eye of a woman who understood the stakes. "Hoodie strings tucked in?" she asked, the same question she posed every morning. Marcus nodded, demonstrating that the drawstrings were safely tucked inside the sweatshirt rather than hanging loose where they might be mistaken for something threatening. "Phone charged and visible," Sandra continued. Marcus held up his phone, showing the full battery and ensuring it was easily accessible. They had learned that having a phone ready to record could sometimes serve as protection, though it wasn't foolproof. "Keys in your hand when you get to the car, not in your pocket," Sandra reminded him, though they both knew he hadn't forgotten. These weren't conversations anymore. They were rituals born of necessity. Marcus grabbed a banana and his backpack, kissing his mother on the cheek before heading toward the door. At the threshold, Sandra called out the same words she said every morning. "Remember, baby, your goal is to come home safe. Everything else can wait." It was 7:15 a.m. when Marcus stepped outside to his 2015 Honda Civic, a reliable car his parents had bought him for his 16th birthday. It wasn't flashy, wasn't expensive, wasn't the kind of vehicle that should draw attention. But Marcus had learned that in his case, simply existing seemed to be enough to warrant scrutiny. He had exactly 18 minutes to drive the 3 miles to Jefferson High School. On a normal day, it should take 8 minutes. But Marcus had learned to build in extra time for the stops that had become as predictable as sunrise. The first stop usually happened on Maple Street, right where it intersects with Oak Avenue. Officer Martinez often positioned his patrol car there, and Marcus had been pulled over at that exact spot 6 times in the past 2 months. The reasons varied: broken tail light that was never actually broken, erratic driving that consisted of going exactly the speed limit, or simply routine checks that seemed anything but routine given their frequency. Today, as Marcus approached the familiar intersection, he saw the patrol car parked exactly where he expected it. His stomach tightened, but he kept his speed steady, his hands visible on the steering wheel, his expression neutral. He had learned not to make eye contact with the officer, not to appear nervous, but also not to seem too relaxed. It was a delicate balance that took months to master. The red and blue lights activated just as Marcus passed the patrol car. He pulled over immediately, putting the car in park and placing both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. His heart rate increased, but outwardly he remained calm. This was routine now. Officer Martinez approached the driver's side window with the slow, deliberate walk that Marcus had come to recognize. He was a man in his 40s, with graying hair and a permanent expression of suspicion. Marcus rolled down his window before the officer reached it. "Good morning, Officer Martinez," Marcos said politely, keeping his voice even and respectful. "License and registration," Martinez said without preamble, as if they hadn't had this exact same interaction multiple times before. Marcus reached slowly for his wallet, narrating his movements as he had been taught. "I'm reaching for my wallet in my back pocket now. My license is inside." He handed over the documents and placed his hands back on the steering wheel. Martinez examined the license with exaggerated care, as if he hadn't seen it numerous times before. "Where are you headed this morning, Marcus?" "To school, sir. Jefferson High School." "Running a little early today, aren't you?" Marcus had learned not to mention that he left early, specifically to account for these stops. "Yes, sir. I like to get there with plenty of time." Martinez walked back to his patrol car, taking Marcus's license with him. This part always took exactly 4 to 6 minutes, during which Marcus sat perfectly still, watching other cars drive past. Some drivers slowed down to look, others quickly averted their eyes. A few neighbors had witnessed these stops over the months, but none had ever stopped or offered to help. While he waited, Marcus thought about the conversation he'd had with his father the previous weekend. Thomas Williams was a postal worker who had lived in this neighborhood for 15 years without incident. But watching his son face repeated police encounters had worn him down. "Maybe you should take the bus," his father had suggested, sitting heavily at the kitchen table after Marcus recounted his latest stop. "Dad, I get stopped walking too," Marcus had replied. It was true. Walking to the corner store, jogging through the neighborhood, even waiting at the bus stop, had all resulted in police interactions. Then maybe. Thomas had started but couldn't finish the sentence. They both knew there was no maybe that would solve this problem. Martinez returned to the car window, handing back the license and registration. "Everything checks out," he said, as if there had been any doubt. "Drive safely." "Yes, sir, thank you," Marcus replied, though he felt no gratitude. As Martinez walked back to his patrol car, Marcus carefully pulled back into traffic. The entire encounter had taken 7 minutes. He now had 11 minutes to get to school, which should have been plenty of time. But Marcus knew there was another common stop location ahead. Sure enough, at the corner of Pine Street and 3rd Avenue, Officer Johnson's patrol car was positioned in the parking lot of a closed gas station. Marcus had been stopped here 4 times in the past month, always by Officer Johnson, always for minor infractions that never resulted in tickets. Today, Johnson pulled out of the parking lot immediately after Marcus passed, following close behind for 3 blocks before activating his lights. Marcus pulled over again, repeating the same routine. Hands on the wheel, window down, documents ready. Officer Johnson was younger than Martinez, probably in his late 20s, with an aggressive attitude that made these encounters particularly stressful. "You know why I stopped you?" Johnson asked, leaning down to look into the car. This was a new question. Usually Johnson stated a reason, however fabricated. Marcus considered his options. Saying no might seem dishonest, but guessing could admit to violations he hadn't committed. "No, sir," Marcus answered honestly. "Your music was pretty loud back there." Marcus's radio hadn't been on. He had learned months ago to drive in complete silence to avoid any possible complaints about noise. But he didn't argue. "I'm sorry, Officer Johnson. I didn't realize. Let me see your license." Marcus went through the familiar routine again, handing over his documents and waiting while Johnson returned to his patrol car. This time, the wait stretched to 8 minutes. Marcus watched the clock on his dashboard tick closer to 8 a.m., knowing he would likely be late for first period. When Johnson returned, he handed back the documents with a warning. "Keep that music down, son. You don't want to disturb the neighborhood." "Yes, sir. I understand." Marcus had 4 minutes to cover the remaining mile to school. He drove exactly the speed limit, arriving in the parking lot just as the first bell rang. Students were streaming through the front doors, backpacks bouncing, conversations flowing, the normal chaos of teenage life that Marcus envied. In first period English, Mrs. Patterson noticed that Marcus seemed distracted. "Everything okay?" she asked quietly as other students worked on their assignments. Marcus nodded automatically. "Yes, ma'am. Just tired." It wasn't entirely untrue. The constant vigilance required to navigate his daily routine was exhausting. But Marcus had learned not to discuss these encounters at school. The few times he had mentioned them to teachers or counselors, he had been met with well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful advice about staying positive and not letting it get to him. During lunch, Marcus sat with his usual group of friends. They were discussing weekend plans, debating which movie to see, complaining about upcoming tests. Normal teenage concerns that felt simultaneously familiar and foreign to Marcus. "You should come to the basketball game Friday," his friend Jake suggested. "It's going to be huge." Marcus hesitated. Evening events meant driving home after dark, which had historically led to more frequent stops. "Maybe," he said noncommittally. "Come on, man. You never hang out anymore," Jake pressed. It was true. Over the past few months, Marcus had declined more and more social invitations. Each outing required careful planning, consideration of routes and timing, and the mental preparation for potential police encounters. It was often easier to just stay home. After school, Marcus faced the return journey. He had learned that afternoon stops were less frequent, but not non-existent. Today, he made it 3 blocks before seeing the familiar sight of Officer Martinez's patrol car pulling a U-turn behind him. This time, Martinez claimed Marcus had been following too closely behind another vehicle. It was the 3rd stop of the day, and Marcus felt his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "Officer Martinez," Marcus said as the policeman approached his window, "this is the 3rd time you've stopped me today." It was the first time Marcus had ever referenced their frequent encounters. Martinez's expression hardened. "Are you questioning my judgment, son?" The threat in the officer's voice was clear. Marcus immediately backed down, his father's warnings echoing in his head. "No, sir. I apologize. I suggest you focus on your driving instead of keeping track of my activities," Martinez said coldly. "License and registration." This stop lasted 12 minutes, longer than any previous encounter. Marcus sat in his car, hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel, as Martinez took his time running the routine check. Several classmates drove past during the stop, and Marcus knew he would face questions the next day. When he finally arrived home at 4:15 p.m., 45 minutes later than usual, his mother was waiting in the living room. "3 stops today?" Sandra asked, reading the exhaustion on her son's face. Marcus nodded, dropping his backpack by the door and slumping into a chair. "Same officers. Martinez twice, Johnson once." Sandra's jaw tightened. They had discussed filing complaints, reaching out to the school administration, even contacting local civil rights organizations. But each option carried risks that their middle-class stability couldn't withstand. Thomas's postal job provided their health insurance. Sandra's position at the local bank depended on maintaining a clean record. Fighting the system could cost them everything. "Maybe we should try a different route tomorrow," Sandra suggested, though they both knew the neighborhood only offered so many alternatives. "Mom," Marcus said quietly, "it's not about the route." Sandra sat down across from her son, studying his face. Over the past 6 months, she had watched him change. The confident, outgoing boy who used to fill the house with laughter and friends had become quiet and cautious. His grades remained good, but his spirit seemed diminished. "You know this isn't your fault, right?" Sandra said. Marcus nodded, but the gesture lacked conviction. "I know, but knowing doesn't make it stop." That evening at dinner, the family discussed Marcus's day with the careful neutrality they had all learned to adopt. Thomas asked about school, Sandra inquired about upcoming assignments, and Marcus provided brief, neutral responses. No one mentioned the police stops directly, but the shadow of them hung over the conversation. After dinner, Marcus retreated to his room to do homework. But instead of opening his textbooks, he sat at his desk and stared out the window at the quiet street. Other families were visible through lit windows, going about their evening routines without the layer of anxiety that permeated his own home. His phone buzzed with text messages from friends, invitations to hang out, questions about weekend plans. Marcus read them but didn't respond immediately. Each social activity required an internal calculation, routes to consider, timing to plan, and the mental energy to prepare for potential encounters. Around 9 p.m., Marcus finally opened his history textbook to read about the civil rights movement. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was reading about protests and progress, about courage in the face of injustice, while he himself had learned to accept daily humiliation as the price of staying safe. His assignment was to write an essay about how past struggles had paved the way for current freedoms. Marcus stared at the blank page on his computer screen, unsure how to reconcile the hopeful narrative expected by his teacher with his lived reality. The next morning, Marcus's alarm buzzed at 6:45 a.m., just like always. He dressed in his carefully chosen clothes, went through the morning safety checklist with his mother, and prepared for another day of navigation through a system that saw him as perpetually suspicious. As he backed out of his driveway, Marcus calculated the timing for his commute. 10 extra minutes for the stops that would inevitably come, plus a few more minutes as a buffer. It had become as automatic as checking his mirrors or adjusting his seatbelt. At the first familiar intersection, Officer Martinez's patrol car was waiting in its usual spot. Marcus pulled over before the lights even activated, saving them both time. He placed his hands on the steering wheel and waited, his expression neutral, his compliance complete. Fighting it had only made things worse. Questioning it had only escalated tensions. This was simply his reality now. As Officer Martinez approached the window, Marcus managed a polite "good morning" and reached for his license. The routine played out exactly as it had dozens of times before, and exactly as it would dozens of times in the future. Some battles are fought with resistance and rebellion. Others are fought through endurance and survival. Marcus had learned which battle he was fighting, even if he hadn't chosen it. When the stop was over and he was driving towards school again, Marcus didn't feel angry anymore. He didn't feel hopeful about change. He felt tired and careful and resigned to a reality that had worn down his defenses until acceptance seemed like the only viable option. The system had won, not through force or violence, but through the slow, steady erosion of a teenager's belief that things could be different. And tomorrow morning, Marcus would set his alarm for 6:45 a.m. and prepare for another day of careful navigation through a world that had taught him to expect nothing more.